the Aztec religion, or what could be more specifically described as the Nahuatl Mexica peoples of central Mexico around Tenochtitlan, have this rich understanding of the world that often comes into disjunction with a more secular view of how reality is set up. However, upon the arrival of the Catholic Franciscans alongside the conquistadors into modern central Mexico, they went about challenging the indigenous leaders and priests, saying that their gods were false.
Now, in response, the rulers and priests said, in their own language,
In Calamantilis, Kineo Tokatihui, Kin Kayeko Titihui, Kima Huits Tilili Tihui Inteteo, Ima Huits Tililoka. Verily, our ancestors gave us their way of life. They followed them as true, they served them, they honored them, the gods. They taught us all their ways of serving, their modes of honoring. Thus before them we eat earth, thus we bleed ourselves, thus we discharge our debts. Verily, it was the gods by whom we live.
Here we can clearly see that there is this connection of understanding that ancestors and gods are one, that there is this connection to them. And even though they have distinct identities, they're also indistinct from one another. And so it is like this non-dualism, but also with a bit of dualism mixed in. This can be really confusing, but it is less so if you remember us talking about Teotl. We've already discussed how Teotl is viewed as this divine, sacred energy, and it's energy in the sense that it is an animating force or sacred power. You could think of power simply as electricity, and it is this thing that animates everything around it. But what often gets overlooked is just how exactly did they conceive of this outside of intellectual circles? How did regular Aztecs view reality around them? And so today we are going to talk about pantheism. Pantheism in the way that the Aztecs would have understood it, why it might differentiate from some other definitions of pantheism, with a brief description of what pantheism is, at least as best as I can understand it, and why this helped your everyday Aztec participate in the life of their communities. Now, this term pantheism actually comes from the English mathematician Joseph Raphson in reaction to his readings of the Jewish philosopher Baruch Spinoza. And he describes pantheism as, quote, a certain universal substance, material, as well as intelligence, that fashions all things that exist out of its own essence. However, both this description and the term pantheism itself were used to attack or discredit people who did not adhere to an ever more Protestantizing England or Holland, where they would use this as a weapon more than as a description of a particular way of thinking. And it can be difficult to divorce it from how, even in the modern day, we can conceive of pantheism if we are from a Western secular society, or we live in one at least, as this sort of free-for-all, do what thou wilt mindset. Now, this is inaccurate in the sense that even though the Aztecs had this understanding of everything as sacred, they still had profane views, like that certain things could be profane or wrong or bad behavior. And so it is not this super individualistic manner of conceiving of reality that is often used, and I'm hesitant to use the word hijack pantheism as a terminology, but certainly takes it in a different direction than the Nahuatl and Mexica peoples would have understood pantheism. One helpful way to navigate the understanding of how profanity can exist within sacredness, meaning a bad behavior or a misuse, would be to look at other ancient traditions and philosophies. Even if they're in their entirety, they come to different conclusions than Aztec metaphysics. For example, in Taoism, the very name itself comes from Tao, which means the way. And so in keeping with the way, You are in keeping with the natural order of things. Another ancient understanding is this teaching of Jesus of Nazareth when he says, I am the way. And then his followers after him were referred to as followers of the way. And so while we can see that there is a common pattern here, which is that there is this desire to be in keeping with the way being a natural way of existing, a proper or correct higher way of existing, is the goal. However, even that terminology, higher, comes from this Christian influence on secular thought, which is that there is a verticality to morality and to existence. Right? That there is this ascension into heaven, and the fall of man is a descension. And so there is this up and down movement, whereas for Aztec pantheism, the easiest way to understand it, maybe, at least as much as I can say, is to, instead of do verticality, see it as horizontal. That there is this spiraling outward. You can see this really well in some of their artwork, where there is a single axial point in the middle, and it spirals outward into angles on angles that eventually turns back in on itself. And that we are all in these different manifestations of Teotl. Professor H.B. Nicholson at UCLA dedicated his whole life to the study of pre-colonial Mexico, and in particular the Aztecs. And in his studies, what he found was that the Mesoamerican pantheon, or pantheons, tended to be organized around several fundamental cult themes, which in turn were analyzed to be able to exist within smaller sub-themes, which he called deity complexes. He generally had 3 cult themes standing out, which he called first, celestial creativity, divine paternalism, second, rain, moisture, and agricultural fertility, and third, war, sacrifice, sanguinary nourishment of the sun and earth. Sanguinary meaning blood. Now that last one, with blood nourishment, we see that there was this belief through a complex constellation of processes that within these sub-themes or these sub-cults, the gods needed to be nourished by their preferred sustenance, which was the human heart, the actual literal human heart, and human blood. And this is why at certain times and moments in the 260-day calendar, there would be higher and lower volumes of human sacrifices occurring. And depending on the natural occurrences of rain and famine, this would wax and wane year after year. Now it would be good to point out that this sanguinary subcult was a subset of the prior subcult, which was focused on rain, moisture, and agriculture. So this blood and heart-focused method of communing with the sacred would occur if this prior one fell out of favor within the community. And so if there is no rain, there is a famine, the crops die, you have to water the earth with blood. You have to water reality from yourself. And so it is not a stretch to say that it is likely blood and water were very closely connected and related to each other in Nahuatl Mexica ancient ways of thinking. Now, of course, these people knew rain came from the sky, and so they associated a higher subset as being the celestial creativity, divine paternalism. And so they understood it slightly in this sense that the sky is paternal and the earth is maternal, right? Mother Earth, Father Sky. We see this in Greek mythology. However, it is important to note that there are 3 deity complexes, Ometeotl, Tezcatlipoca, and Xutecuhtli. The Ometeotl includes a cluster of deities which Nicholson says were in effect only aspects of a single fundamental creative celestial paternal deity. And so Ometeotl stands out among the deities of this theme as a sexually dualistic, primordial generative power. James Maffie suggests that Ometeotl and the other deities that make up this said cluster, Omecihuatl, Ometecuhtli, Tonacatehutli, and Tonacaquihuatl, are actually specific constellations or processes concerned with this generation, sustenance, and renewing of Teot. And so as such, there is both a masculine and feminine, to use archetypal language, aspect to Ometeot. And within this highest sub-theme, this was seen as the pure ordering of things. And then these are manifested in the other subsets that follow from this celestial paternalistic subcult. Lastly, it would be helpful to tidy up on that term sacred and explain what is actually meant by sacred in the Nahuatl Mexica mindset. So sacred actually meant something very different to them than it does to modern Western thinking, which is that it is not this set-apartness, which is what the term sacred originally meant when it came from sacra, meaning to set apart. And so the reason why the word sacred is still used, even if grammatically it is finicky, to say the least, when speaking in English, is because that sacred, the Western understanding, and the Aztec one both do the same thing, which is that it animates the community. It moves the community towards the way. It moves them in the direction, for the Aztecs, the center, and for the Westerner, to enlightenment. And whether it is about enlightenment or about centeredness, both are trying to reach the same vague goal, which is to have stability and clarity and move forward in the world in accordance with their understanding of the way. As always, thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.